The morning air over the small riverside town was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and pine. It was a morning like any other in 1975, one of those quiet, lingering dawns where the world seemed to hold its breath for a moment before the day's routines took over. Children chased one another along dusty sidewalks, the bells of the local school rang somewhere in the distance, and smoke rose in delicate spirals from chimneys. In a modest home by the river, James Carter, a man whose calm demeanor and steady hands had earned him the quiet respect of neighbors, moved with purpose. There was no hint of foreboding in his motions, only the simple, meticulous care of a father preparing for a weekend trip. The fishing rods were arranged with precision, the lures checked and rechecked, hooks aligned like tiny silver promises of the day to come. His daughters, Emily and Sarah, were buzzing with excitement, their laughter weaving through the kitchen, a sound as ordinary and beautiful as the morning light filtering through the windows. Emily, the elder, was responsible in her movements yet carried an air of mischief, teasing her sister about who would catch the first fish. Sarah, younger and more impulsive, laughed louder, spilling cereal across the table and wiping it away with a grin that made her father shake his head with amused exasperation. In these moments, nothing seemed unusual. Nothing hinted at the fracture of fate that would soon rend the town's quiet heart. Neighbors waved from across the street as the family loaded the car. Mr. Henderson, a retired man with a habit of leaning on his cane, called out a friendly reminder for them to be careful, his voice carrying over the morning bustle. James responded with a nod, the corners of his mouth lifting in a smile that did little to betray the weight of the responsibilities he carried silently. He never spoke much about his own worries, he had learned long ago that the world often felt heavier when voiced aloud. The girls waved energetically from the back seat, their youthful optimism a stark contrast to the faint shadow that always seemed to linger in the corners of adult life, the weight of what is unseen, unspoken, and unknowable. As the car turned onto the winding road leading to the river, the landscape opened into a panorama of golden fields and silvered water, the early sun reflecting off the ripples in a manner almost too picturesque to feel real. The narrative lens lingers on this scene, not merely to paint a postcard of idyllic Americana, but to create a contrast, the fragile perfection of a single ordinary morning, a canvas that would soon be scarred by disappearance. There is a subtle tension here, a cinematic cue that something is shifting beneath the surface. Even the river, calm and glimmering, seems to hold its breath, a silent witness to the events that would unfold. Inside the car, conversation is light. Emily talks about the fish she hopes to catch, Sarah counts the number of birds that cross the road, and James hums a tune from decades past, a melody that feels like a memory and a warning all at once. The camera lingers on the small, intimate gestures, the way James adjusts the rearview mirror, how Emily brushes a strand of hair from her eyes, Sarah tapping impatiently on the dashboard. Each movement, each laugh, each sigh is imbued with normalcy, the kind of ordinary moments that later become haunting in memory precisely because they were so ordinary. There is an underlying rhythm to this scene, a slow cinematic pull that emphasizes the fragility of everyday life. The river awaits them, stretching beyond the horizon, a symbol of leisure and freedom. And yet, as they drive, the narrative begins to trace invisible threads of suspense, the emptiness of certain roads, the flicker of shadows beneath trees, the echo of a car door slamming in an otherwise silent morning. It is subtle, almost imperceptible, but it primes the audience for the dissonance that will shatter this scene of domestic serenity. By the time they reach the outskirts of town, the audience has absorbed the full texture of the Carters' lives, the love, the laughter, the small imperfections that make them human. This section does more than introduce characters, it creates emotional stakes. The viewers feel the weight of the imminent disappearance because they have already inhabited this morning, breathed the air, and shared the laughter of a family who seems untouchable, yet whose vulnerability is woven into every mundane detail. The river, the car, the laughter, all become charged with foreboding, making the eventual absence of the family all the more piercing. The narrative closes this opening section on a note of lingering calm. The family moves forward, the sun climbing higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the fields, reflecting in the river's surface. It is a world suspended between safety and danger, familiarity and uncertainty. The audience, intimately connected to James, Emily, and Sarah, is left with a quiet, unsettled tension, a sense that everything is about to change, yet nothing in the scene gives away what is to come. It is the beauty and terror of ordinary life, fleeting, fragile, and capable of vanishing in an instant. The morning had fully awakened, and the town's rhythm continued its gentle pulse, but for the Carters, the day was a promise of adventure. James navigated the narrow roads with practiced ease, the hum of the engine blending with the occasional chirp of birds overhead. The air smelled faintly of wet earth, the aroma of a nearby river mingling with the warmth of sunlight spilling across the dashboard. The girls pressed their faces against the windows, eyes wide with anticipation, catching glimpses of fields that rippled like oceans of gold and shadows of trees that danced across the road. Their laughter filled the car in quick bursts, the kind that belongs to moments of pure, unrestrained joy, before dissolving into excited chatter about what lay ahead. Emily leaned forward, speaking quickly, detailing a strategy for the fishing trip. She had read about the best spots along the riverbank, where the currents twisted and eddies formed small pockets ideal for catching bass. Her fingers traced the outline of a map she had drawn, the pencil marks smudged in places from her excitement. Sarah, restless and impulsive, kept interjecting with questions and playful challenges. Who would catch the first fish, who would spot the most unusual bird, who could skip stones the farthest. Their voices overlapped, weaving a tapestry of familiarity and sisterly rivalry that James listened to in quiet amusement, his eyes briefly flicking to the rearview mirror, watching the small motions of his daughters and absorbing every detail like a man who knew that moments like this were precious precisely because they were fleeting. The road curved toward the river, and the landscape changed subtly, the fields giving way to denser trees and the occasional wooden fence marking private property. The sunlight danced through the branches, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow that seemed almost to pulse with the car's movement. The narrative lingers on these details, the glint of sun on a metal fence post, the way a sudden breeze rippled the leaves, the distant murmur of water. Each observation grounds the audience in the carter's world, deepening emotional investment. The ordinary textures of life, the smell of leather in the car, the faint stickiness of spilled juice, the faint rumble of the engine, become charged with significance, because these are the final ordinary hours the audience will share with them before everything changes. James parked the car near the riverbank, the gravel crunching softly beneath the tires. He stepped out, stretching, the warmth of the morning sun on his shoulders, and began unloading the gear with deliberate care. Rods were checked once more, bait was secured in small containers, and the tackle box was carefully placed on the ground. The girls jumped from the car, their shoes crunching the gravel as they ran ahead, laughing, their hair catching the sunlight. There was a fluidity to their movements, a vitality that made the stillness of the surrounding trees and water seem even more alive in contrast. The narrative emphasizes the sensory details here, the sound of boots on gravel, the laughter echoing across the river, the gentle lapping of water against the shore, to make the audience feel fully present in the scene. Emily bent down to examine the water, her reflection fractured across ripples. She pointed out a cluster of rocks where fish might gather, and Sarah immediately challenged her, leaping from stone to stone with an exuberance that made James chuckle quietly. The camera lingers on the father's face, a study in quiet satisfaction and paternal pride. He watches his daughters, the way the sunlight hits their faces, the way their hands move with a mixture of skill and recklessness, and for a moment, the world is perfect. There is no hint of the looming void, no whisper of what is about to come. The narrative uses this moment to create a stark contrast between the serenity of life in motion and the chaos of absence that will soon follow. As the morning unfolds, small details of their interactions paint a portrait of the family. Emily's protective instincts toward Sarah, Sarah's uncontainable energy, and James' patient guidance. The girls argue playfully over who gets to use which rod, whose turn it is to throw the first cast, while James gently mediates, offering suggestions and occasionally laughing at their antics. There is warmth in these moments, the kind of warmth that the audience recognizes from their own memories of family, of mornings filled with mundane rituals elevated by love and presence. These interactions also serve a dual purpose. They anchor the narrative emotionally while foreshadowing the poignancy of their absence, making the eventual disappearance all the more affecting. The narrative also draws attention to the environment, a character in its own right, the river winding gracefully, the surface shimmering with sunlight, the occasional splash of a fish breaking the water's surface, and the distant sound of leaves rustling in the wind. Each element adds texture and atmosphere, creating a cinematic space where life and potential danger coexist. The river, so inviting and familiar, is rendered with an almost hypnotic beauty, reinforcing both the promise of leisure and the subtle undercurrent of unease that will ripple through the story. As they begin casting their lines, Emily's rod twitches slightly, a small catch that sparks cheers and playful rivalry. Sarah squeals in delight, and James smiles, guiding her in the correct technique. These ordinary victories, the small celebrations of life's simplicity, are layered with dramatic irony. The audience knows that this joy is fragile, and that every carefree moment contributes to the haunting memory that will linger long after the family vanishes. The narrative dwells on each sound, gesture, and glance, building intimacy and emotional resonance, ensuring that viewers are not passive observers but participants in this final morning of innocence. By the time the sun climbs higher, the scene has established a full emotional and sensory palette. The laughter, the gentle arguments, the rustling trees, and the shimmering water all exist in delicate harmony, a fleeting perfection that contrasts sharply with the suspense of the story to come. This section closes on a note of quiet anticipation. The family is fully immersed in the day's promise, unaware that the currents of fate are already shifting beneath the surface, ready to pull them into a mystery that will leave the town haunted for decades. The afternoon sun began to tilt toward the west, casting long, liquid shadows across the riverbank. James and his daughters were still absorbed in the quiet rhythm of fishing, laughter mingling with the soft murmur of the river. From a distance, the town seemed tranquil, the fields golden and still, as if frozen in time. Yet beneath this idyllic surface, a subtle dissonance had begun to stir. The sun would set, the river would darken, and the family would not return. In these moments, the ordinary world continued, oblivious to the tragedy about to unfold, and the narrative hones in on the stark, almost cruel contrast between life's continuity and the rupture of absence. By late afternoon, the family had moved farther along the river, exploring small coves and bends that promised hidden pockets of fish. Emily, ever meticulous, had begun to chart the river's subtle currents, while Sarah darted along the shore, collecting small stones and twigs. James followed at a measured pace, ensuring their safety but also allowing them the freedom to explore. It was a scene of intimacy and trust, the kind of ordinary adventure that binds families, that lingers in memory with both warmth and ache. Yet even as the narrative luxuriates in these details, it hints at unease. The occasional drift of fog along the water, the sudden snap of a twig that echoes unnaturally loud in the still afternoon, the faint impression that something unseen watches from the tree line. Hours passed with the river reflecting the shifting light. James cast a line, the bobber floating like a tiny vessel on the surface, while Emily whispered encouragement to Sarah. The girls laughed at the small victories, the tiny flurries of movement in the water, the elusive fish that always seemed just out of reach. The narrative lingers on these sensory impressions. The gentle tension of a fishing rod, the cold splash of river water on hands, the laughter resonating across a silent landscape. These details ground the audience in reality, heightening the eventual dissonance when those very ordinary moments become the last they will ever see. The first unease emerged when the tide of routine began to shift. The time stretched, the sunlight waned, and the return journey remained uninitiated. James glanced at his watch, a habitual gesture that became weighted with the first hints of worry. The daughters were unaware, caught up in their exploration, but the narrative emphasizes James' subtle awareness of something slipping, a feeling that is hard to articulate, an intuition that often precedes disaster. The tension begins to build not with action but with a quiet, creeping awareness of absence yet to be confirmed. By early evening, the first signs of real concern surfaced. A nearby fisherman, familiar with the river's currents, noticed that the Carter family's boat, usually distinctive and visible, had not moved. The fisherman's voice carried a hint of unease, a tone that drew the attention of others along the riverbank. The narrative shifts to the town, where small, ordinary routines continued obliviously, unaware of the approaching calamity. The contrast between the calm life of the town and the invisible crisis at the river amplifies suspense. Friends and neighbors begin to notice the absence. Their casual inquiries are met with silence at the Carter household. This silence, so ordinary and expected in other contexts, begins to press down like a physical weight, laden with foreboding. By twilight, the family had still not returned. Concern escalated into action. James' car remained parked at the riverbank, the gravel undisturbed except for the faint impressions of footprints leading toward the water. The narrative lingers on these fragments of evidence: the bent grass where a step fell, a fishing rod left precariously on the bank, a small splash where someone might have dipped a hand. Each detail is described with careful attention to texture, sound, and light, transforming ordinary elements into haunting clues. The audience, now emotionally invested, experiences a mounting dread, feeling as though they themselves were walking along the empty shore, searching for a presence that has vanished. The sheriff's office received the first call as darkness began to fall. Officers drove along the winding roads to the river, flashlights cutting through the dimming light. They found the car, the fishing gear, the small disturbances in the landscape, but no family. Panic began to edge into procedural formality, logbooks filled, questions asked, the first lines of a search protocol initiated. Local volunteers gathered, their torches and lanterns casting long, uncertain shadows on the water and trees. The narrative emphasizes the emotional texture of these moments: whispered speculations, anxious glances, the tremor in a voice as someone calls the father's name into the night, only to hear it swallowed by the river and the forest. Search efforts intensified as darkness fully enveloped the river. Small boats were launched, the water slick and reflective under lantern light. Dogs were brought in, sniffing along the bank, noses close to the earth in hope of a scent. Each effort is described cinematically: the ripple of water under oars, the low murmur of voices calling names, the glint of a flashlight catching an empty space where a body should be. The narrative emphasizes contrast, the anticipation of discovery against the cruel reality of emptiness, the town's hope against the widening shadow of anxiety. Emotional tension is heightened as each searcher experiences the surreal nature of looking for life in the absence of signs, the psychological strain beginning to take its toll. By late night, despair began to settle. The town, once tranquil, was now marked by the low hum of engines, the distant barking of dogs, and the constant repetition of a single terrifying question: where were the Carters? Families huddled indoors, the normal rhythms of dinner and conversation replaced with anxious silence. The sheriff coordinated volunteers, families, and townspeople, but every turn of the river revealed only the ordinary scene: water lapping against the bank, shadows stretching under the moonlight, and nothing more. The narrative dwells on these contrasts, life continuing around the searchers, the river indifferent, the night unyielding, creating a deep, haunting sense of emotional unease. The section closes with a lingering, cinematic tension: the Carters have vanished. Nothing definitive explains their disappearance, and the river, which had promised leisure and joy earlier in the day, now seems an ominous, unknowable expanse. The narrative emphasizes emotional resonance, the weight of uncertainty, the sudden fragility of ordinary life, and the dawning understanding that this disappearance is not merely a pause in routine but a rupture that will mark the town forever. Shadows fall across the riverbank, the night stretches on, and the audience is left suspended in the same anxious emptiness felt by the townspeople, anticipating what clues, or horrors, might emerge next. By the next morning, the stillness of the town had shifted. The usual rhythm of daily life, the creak of shutters, the aroma of bread from the bakery, children's laughter on the streets, was fractured by a creeping, uneasy tension. The disappearance of James Carter and his daughters had rippled through the community like a stone cast into a placid pond, distorting everything it touched. Neighbors whispered in tight clusters, their voices low and urgent, full of speculation and fear. The familiar faces of the town now seemed shadowed, each glance a question, each smile tinged with uncertainty. It was as though the disappearance had forced everyone to confront the fragility of normal life, the sense that the ordinary could vanish without warning. People began recounting the Carters' last known movements, their words a mixture of admiration and guilt. "I saw them leave," one neighbor said, her hands trembling slightly as she wrung a tea towel. "They seemed fine, so normal. How could this happen?" Another added, "Maybe they wandered too far, or got caught in the current." Each suggestion carried the weight of hope and despair simultaneously, but none offered clarity. The narrative focuses on these micro-emotions, the subtle quivers, the hesitant glances, the tiny sighs of disbelief, turning the town itself into a character defined by fear and uncertainty. Rumors spread quickly, fueled by the natural human need to explain the unexplainable. Some whispered of accidents in the river, imagining unseen rocks and hidden currents pulling the family into darkness. Others speculated about foul play, reluctant to name names but unable to suppress the gnawing suspicion that something sinister had reached into their quiet lives. The contrast between the peaceful image of the town and the suspicion now simmering beneath the surface creates a palpable psychological tension. Even familiar streets seem transformed, corners and alleyways taking on a strange, shadowy quality. The town had become a liminal space, suspended between reality and fear, past and what might yet happen. The local sheriff, a man accustomed to minor disturbances rather than vanishing families, found himself thrust into uncharted territory. He coordinated search efforts, questioned witnesses, and combed through the riverbanks, but every answer seemed to generate more questions. In town, he was the figure people both trusted and scrutinized, embodying authority while struggling against the overwhelming unknown. His frustration and quiet anxiety are described in cinematic detail: the furrowed brow, the sigh into a crumpled hand, the late-night phone calls where silence answered more questions than words. The sheriff's struggle mirrors that of the townspeople, emphasizing the emotional stakes and the growing sense of helplessness that pervades the community. The schoolyard, usually a place of routine and predictability, became a hive of whispered conversations. Children discussed the disappearance in hushed tones, while parents hovered nearby, their own faces betraying the fear they tried to suppress. Teachers struggled to maintain order, but every glance at the clock, every door opening or closing, reminded them of what had been lost. Even the smallest, most ordinary spaces were transformed into loci of tension. The narrative emphasizes this psychological shift. Familiar spaces no longer feel safe, and ordinary routines feel fragile and precarious. Neighbors began to question their own perceptions of safety and trust. Long-standing relationships were strained as hidden resentments surfaced. "Why wasn't anyone watching?" one woman asked, her voice trembling with anger and grief. "Could someone have taken them?" Even those who prided themselves on knowing everyone in town began to feel uncertain, suspicious of the very people they had trusted most. The narrative uses these interpersonal fractures to heighten emotional depth, showing how fear reshapes community dynamics, turning solidarity into tension, familiarity into doubt. As search parties combed the river and surrounding woods, volunteers' hope battled against growing dread. Lanterns swung in the darkness, illuminating only partial glimpses of the terrain. Dogs sniffed tirelessly at riverbanks, catching scents that led nowhere. The narrative lingers on the small, haunting details: a discarded fishing hat caught on a branch, a ripple in the water that suggested movement but revealed nothing, the echo of a voice calling a name that went unanswered. These fragments amplify suspense and underscore the emotional reality of the situation. The town is alive with concern, yet powerless to grasp what has been lost. By mid-morning, the community had begun to coalesce around shared grief and uncertainty. A meeting was called at the town hall, where faces etched with worry and exhaustion discussed the search efforts. Some offered rational strategies, others presented theories that bordered on the paranoid. The room buzzed with tension, each idea layered with fear, hope, and desperation. The narrative contrasts the collective energy of the town against the absence of the family, highlighting the human need for action and understanding when confronted with the inexplicable. Even ordinary tasks, shops opening, deliveries arriving, children walking to school, took on an uncanny tone. Each action was a reminder of what had been interrupted, a quiet echo of a life that had been abruptly fractured. The narrative draws the audience's attention to these micro-moments, allowing them to feel the town's disorientation and the psychological weight of uncertainty. Every footstep, every glance, every murmured question deepens the emotional resonance, reinforcing the sense that the disappearance has permeated every corner of the community. By evening, suspicion and fear had fully entwined with grief. The town streets were quieter, and conversations were laden with unease. Neighbors huddled in doorways, exchanging fragments of information and tentative theories. Parents held children closer, teenagers whispered about what might have happened, their imaginations filling in the gaps with stories that danced between hope and horror. The narrative emphasizes this emotional spectrum, showing how the unknown transforms both environment and psyche. The once innocent town now pulses with tension, a place where the ordinary feels precarious and every shadow seems to carry meaning. The section closes with a lingering shot of the river at twilight, its surface reflecting the fading sky like a mirror of uncertainty. The town sleeps uneasily, haunted by questions that cannot yet be answered. The audience is left with a deep, emotional understanding of how fear, grief, and suspicion can transform a community. Ordinary life continues, yet it is irrevocably altered. The carter's absence has become a silent, pervasive force, threading through the town, shaping perceptions, relationships, and the fragile sense of safety. In these moments, the emotional stakes are fully established, and the stage is set for the mysteries, clues, and shocking revelations that will follow. The days following the disappearance blurred into a tense rhythm of hope, fear, and relentless searching. The town, still suspended between disbelief and dread, watched as the first leads began to emerge, small, almost imperceptible clues that hinted at the carter's presence and suggested that their disappearance was neither random nor entirely mysterious. It began with footprints along the riverbank, impressions pressed into damp soil that seemed fresh yet pointed to nowhere. Investigators examined them with careful attention, tracing the faint impressions like a map, each step a question, each disturbance in the earth an invitation to imagine what had happened. These footprints, ordinary and yet profoundly significant, became the first signs that the family had left the river alive, or at least that someone had walked along its banks after them. The discovery of a torn piece of clothing intensified both hope and fear. A sleeve, its fabric soaked and frayed at the edges, was found snagged on a low branch near a bend in the river. The color, a familiar shade Emily often wore, made the find almost unbearably intimate. Investigators, townspeople, and volunteers crowded the area, eyes wide, hearts hammering with anticipation. The narrative lingers on these details: the texture of the fabric, the way light glinted off a small tear, the faint smell of water and earth clinging to it. These minute sensory cues transform an ordinary object into a symbol of vulnerability and loss, amplifying the emotional weight of the search. The next lead was even more puzzling. The family's fishing boat, once a cheerful vessel of leisure, was found abandoned a few miles downstream. It floated half-submerged near a cluster of reeds, rocking gently in the current, empty yet ominously intact. The oars were still inside, and a fishing rod had been left resting on the bench, as if the family had simply stepped away for a moment and never returned. The contrast between the boat's apparent ordinariness and the alarming absence of its occupants created a quiet terror. The narrative dwells on the small details, the gentle ripple of water against the hull, the faint smell of wet wood, the way the sunlight caught the surface of the river, glinting like fractured glass. These details are described in cinematic fashion, turning the scene into a space of suspense, poignancy, and haunting beauty. Investigators expanded the search outward, combing the banks and nearby woods, but the clues remained maddeningly ambiguous. A small, hand-carved wooden charm, the kind the daughters were known to carry, was found tangled in reeds near the water's edge. Footprints led to it but disappeared abruptly, as if the earth itself had swallowed the trail. The narrative emphasizes the emotional texture of these discoveries, the simultaneous spark of hope and the deepening shadow of despair. Each fragment is a reminder that life once existed here, laughter once echoed, yet now only absence remains. This duality, hope and despair intertwined, is central to the emotional architecture of the story. Interviews with fictionalized searchers and local witnesses add layers of intimacy and realism. One man recalled glimpsing a small figure on the riverbank at dusk, indistinct but unmistakably human. Another described hearing laughter in the distance, only to find the banks empty. These memories, colored by fear and the passage of time, create a cinematic layering of perception and reality. The audience is drawn into the uncertainty, experiencing the tension between what might have been and what is verifiable. The narrative emphasizes the fragility of memory and perception, making the search as much psychological as physical. As the investigation continued, the town's collective anxiety deepened. Families whispered about what the evidence might mean, turning over possibilities in hushed tones. Could the footprints and clothing indicate an accident? Or did they suggest a more deliberate, sinister act? The narrative lingers on the subtle interpersonal dynamics that these clues provoke, neighbors questioning each other's recollections, lingering glances that suggest suspicion, and the slow erosion of trust in a community once defined by certainty and familiarity. The ordinary textures of life, shops opening, children walking to school, neighbors greeting each other, now carried an undercurrent of tension, each action shadowed by the unknown. The police attempted to map the patterns of the clues, connecting footprints, objects, and sightings into a tentative chronology. They measured distances, examined water currents, and reconstructed possible scenarios. Yet every lead seemed to generate more questions than answers. The narrative emphasizes the painstaking attention to detail, the almost obsessive care with which investigators examined each fragment, and the human tendency to cling to even the smallest hint of hope. This methodical approach contrasts sharply with the town's emotional volatility, highlighting the tension between rational inquiry and psychological strain. Late one afternoon, a particularly strange discovery intensified the mystery. A note, partially torn and water-stained, was found near a bend in the river where reeds clung thickly to the shore. The handwriting was small and meticulous, vaguely familiar, but only fragments of words could be discerned. It was a whisper from the unknown, a message half-concealed and tantalizing in its ambiguity. Investigators and townspeople alike speculated endlessly, interpreting its possible meanings, each theory layered with both fear and longing. The narrative focuses on the note as a symbol, an echo of the family's presence, a fragment of communication that bridges absence and imagination. The emotional weight of these clues became a shared experience for the town. Volunteers who had never met the family personally felt grief as intensely as those who had. Small rituals began to emerge, flowers left by the riverbank, candles lit in the town square, prayers whispered at sunset. The narrative emphasizes how evidence transforms from a mere physical object into a vessel for collective emotion. Ordinary items, footprints, clothing, a boat, a note, take on profound symbolic weight, becoming the focus of hope, fear, and imagination. By the end of this section, the audience is fully immersed in the duality of the investigation, the tangible, procedural aspect of evidence and the intangible, psychological impact of ambiguity. Each clue has advanced the narrative, deepened emotional engagement, and set the stage for the shocking discoveries to come. The river, once a simple setting for a family outing, now looms as a character itself, mysterious, unpredictable, and inexorably intertwined with the fate of the Carters. Shadows lengthen across the water, and the narrative closes with the haunting suggestion that the story is far from over. Every clue, no matter how small, is a thread leading deeper into the enigma that will consume the town's imagination for years to come. The river had grown restless in the days since the disappearance, its placid surface now a mirror for the town's collective anxiety. Search parties continued, eyes scanning the banks, lanterns cutting through foggy dawns, and boats skimming over the water, but still, the Carters remained absent. Then, on a quiet morning, a discovery under the old wooden bridge changed everything. It was subtle at first, a glint of something unusual in the shallow water beneath the timbers, but as searchers approached, the significance became undeniable. The town would never forget the day they realized that this simple structure, crossed countless times in ordinary routines, held secrets that defied explanation. The first to notice it was a local fisherman who had returned to the bridge, hoping the morning light might reveal something missed the night before. His eyes caught a flash, a small, metallic object wedged between the supports. As he reached down, water rippling against his boots, he uncovered a cluster of belongings. Not gruesome, not violent, yet the items radiated absence and mystery. A pair of worn shoes, a fishing hat damp and misshapen, and a notebook with pages curling from moisture. Nothing immediately explained what had happened, yet the emotional weight was staggering. These were fragments of ordinary life, now imbued with extraordinary meaning, signaling both presence and vanishing. Word spread quickly. Volunteers, townspeople, and police converged on the bridge, drawn by curiosity, fear, and the compelling need to bear witness. The scene was charged with emotion, hushed whispers, wide eyes, the tremor in voices that tried to remain steady. Each item was handled with care, photographed, and catalogued, yet the true significance lay beyond documentation. It was in the weight of absence, in the silent questions hanging over the water. The narrative dwells on these emotional textures, showing how ordinary objects, a hat, a notebook, a pair of shoes, become vessels for the town's grief and imagination, carrying both hope and despair. The bridge itself became a character in the unfolding drama. Its timbers, weathered and moss-covered, groaned slightly under the weight of footsteps. Shadows pooled beneath the structure, shifting with the morning sun. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and river water, a sensory backdrop that heightened the tension. Cinematic attention lingers on every detail, a rivet glinting like a drop of light, a stray feather caught on a post, the gentle ripple of the current distorting reflections. The ordinary, familiar bridge was transformed into a locus of mystery, a place where reality and imagination intersected in ways the town had never anticipated. Investigators carefully reconstructed the scene. The items were scattered in a pattern that suggested movement but offered no answers. Footprints in the mud were erratic, leading in multiple directions before vanishing altogether. The notebook's pages revealed faint scribbles, almost indecipherable, but hinting at thought, presence, and perhaps anxiety. The narrative focuses on the psychological impact of these clues. They were tangible proof that the Carters had been here, that they existed in this space, yet the absence of bodies or definitive explanation deepened the mystery. Each detail became a psychological puzzle, a silent echo of lives disrupted and vanished. Locals gathered at a safe distance, watching as the investigators worked. There was a sense of communal shock, an almost sacred awe in the presence of these remnants. Some wept quietly, overwhelmed by the intimacy of the discovery. Others stood rigid, trying to contain disbelief with rational speculation. The narrative emphasizes contrast here, the calm, everyday structure of the bridge and river juxtaposed with the charged, fragile emotions of those witnessing the scene. Even as the evidence suggested that the family had been physically present, it offered no comfort, only more questions. Speculation surged almost immediately. Some suggested that the placement of items was deliberate, a trail left intentionally by someone trying to communicate. Others feared a more sinister interpretation, that these were the last vestiges of an accident, a struggle, or something darker. The narrative lingers on these conflicting emotions, showing how fear, hope, and imagination intermingle in a community already fractured by uncertainty. Each theory is colored by emotion. Relief mingles with dread, rationality with paranoia, the desire for closure with the torment of unanswered questions. The emotional resonance extended beyond the immediate discovery. For families in the town, the bridge symbolized the thin boundary between safety and danger. Ordinary routines, walking across a bridge, fishing by the river, watching children play, were suddenly infused with latent anxiety. The narrative emphasizes how one discovery can recalibrate perception, turning familiar spaces into landscapes of caution, reflection, and emotional intensity. The bridge, once a simple passage over water, became a psychological marker, a place where the known and unknown collided. By the end of the day, the town was both captivated and unsettled. The items removed from beneath the bridge were taken for closer examination, yet the questions they raised remained. Where had the family gone? What had happened after they left this spot? And most haunting of all, why did ordinary objects, shoes, a hat, a notebook, carry such emotional weight, speaking louder than words ever could? The narrative closes the section with lingering attention on the bridge itself, its shadows stretching long under the evening sun, the river below reflecting uncertainty and grief. It is both a literal and metaphorical threshold, a space of transition, a silent witness to the disappearance, and a haunting emblem of the mystery that would grip the town for years. In this moment, the bridge became a mirror of the town's collective psyche. Calm surfaces hid currents of fear and speculation. The ordinary, once a comfort, had transformed into a puzzle. The discovery was profound not because it offered answers, but because it forced confrontation with the unknown. The narrative emphasizes the tension between tangible evidence and the emotional void left behind, drawing the audience into the town's psychological landscape as much as the physical search. Shadows deepen, ripples spread across the water, and the haunting weight of absence presses against every observer, setting the stage for secrets, revelations, and the unsettling truth still waiting to emerge. As the days turned into a week, the bridge discovery lingered in the town's collective consciousness like a persistent shadow. The items beneath the timbers, shoes, a hat, a notebook, had been catalogued and examined, but they offered no clear explanation. Instead, they invited speculation, imagination, and an uncomfortable intimacy with the absent family. The town began to look at James Carter not merely as a father who had vanished with his daughters, but as a man with a past, a life of hidden depth that suddenly seemed more complex than anyone had realized. Rumors and half-remembered anecdotes began circulating. James' meticulous habits, the quiet pride in his daughter's accomplishments, and subtle hints from neighbors about struggles long kept private. The narrative draws the audience into the psychological texture of the town. People began to ask themselves questions they had never considered. What did James think about when he looked at the river? Did he ever feel fear, anger, or regret? What could have driven a calm, dependable man into a situation where he and his children might disappear? Even small details, the way he always tied his shoelaces twice, the careful folding of maps for every trip, the tendency to walk the girls to school even when it was inconvenient, took on new significance, viewed now through the lens of uncertainty and suspicion. Ordinary life, once reassuring, became a canvas for speculation. Neighbors spoke of Emily and Sarah in ways that revealed both affection and loss. Emily's precision, her quiet intelligence, her attempts to care for her sister, were described with reverence and sorrow. Sarah's laughter, her impulsive streak, her way of turning small moments into adventure, seemed almost mythical in retrospect. The narrative lingers on these emotional impressions, showing how the disappearance transformed memories into something sacred, almost cinematic. The audience begins to feel the weight of absence as a tangible force, shaping perceptions and relationships. Meanwhile, investigators began to probe deeper into James' life, searching for clues that might explain the mystery. They examined work records, financial statements, and personal journals, looking for any indication of motive, threat, or instability. What emerged was a portrait of a man who was outwardly ordinary yet privately laden with complexity. He was careful, thoughtful, and loving, but he carried burdens he rarely shared, an unspoken tension between responsibility and desire, the quiet stress of providing, and the unvoiced fears of failing his children. These nuances are drawn with cinematic attention, emphasizing small gestures and habits that now take on haunting significance. A folded handkerchief, a lingering glance at a family photograph, a pen paused over a notebook page as if weighing the gravity of thoughts never committed to words. The town, caught between hope and suspicion, began to fracture subtly. Longtime neighbors who had exchanged friendly greetings now looked at one another with doubt, their imaginations filling the void left by absence. Small slights, forgotten arguments, and unspoken resentments resurfaced, refracted through the lens of the disappearance. The narrative emphasizes the emotional texture of this social upheaval, the weight of collective anxiety, the distortion of ordinary relationships, and the way fear transforms both environment and perception. Even the streets, familiar and comforting, seemed to carry the echo of absence, each empty sidewalk or quiet doorway a reminder that life had been disrupted in ways that could not yet be comprehended. One particularly poignant moment came when a neighbor recalled a conversation with James weeks before the trip. He had spoken, almost in passing, about wanting to teach his daughters the subtle rhythms of nature, how to read the river's current, how to understand the behavior of birds, how to feel the wind's direction on a summer day. At the time, it had seemed like an ordinary, loving parent's reflection. In hindsight, it resonated with an almost eerie prescience. The narrative lingers on this memory, using it to underscore the tension between ordinary gestures and extraordinary consequences. Small, intimate details become magnified, charged with emotional weight, and the audience feels both nostalgia and unease simultaneously. As speculation about James' intentions intensified, townspeople began revisiting their own memories of him. Some recalled moments of visible stress, a subtle furrowed brow when confronted with trivial challenges. Others remembered his meticulous nature, how he would organize tools, align fishing rods, or prepare detailed itineraries for weekend trips. The narrative emphasizes the duality of his character, a man outwardly controlled and composed, yet inwardly complex, navigating emotional currents that no one else fully understood. These details add psychological depth, allowing the audience to empathize with both his humanity and the mystery surrounding him. At the same time, the daughters' personalities were examined through the lens of absence. Emily's protective instincts and quiet intelligence were contrasted with Sarah's spontaneity and exuberance. Their bond was described with affection and nuance, each sister complementing the other in ways that heightened the tragedy of their disappearance. The audience is drawn into the emotional landscape of the family, feeling the resonance of loss and the fragility of ordinary life. The section closes with a quiet, haunting reflection on absence and human perception. The bridge, the river, and the scattered belongings are revisited in the mind's eye, symbols of presence and loss intertwined. The town, still grappling with uncertainty, becomes a stage for psychological tension, emotional reflection, and cinematic introspection. The narrative emphasizes that the story is not merely about physical clues or procedural investigation, but about the human need to understand, to connect, and to find meaning in what has vanished. In these moments, suspense is emotional as much as procedural, drawing the audience deeper into the mystery, while leaving them aware of the delicate, haunting beauty of what remains unseen. In the days following the discovery under the bridge, the town's unease deepened. The fragments of the carter's presents, shoes, hat, notebook, had been examined, documented, and discussed, but they raised more questions than answers. And as the investigation continued, small, hidden corners of the town's history and its residents' lives began to surface, revealing a complexity that few had anticipated. The disappearance of James and his daughters was no longer just a tragedy. It had become a lens through which old secrets, rivalries, and quiet fears were magnified. The narrative shifts between the river and the town, showing how the physical mystery mirrored the psychological turbulence. Investigators combed through records, talked to neighbors, and retraced every known movement of the family. What they found was ordinary on the surface: friendly neighbors, routine trips, and no evident signs of trouble. Yet beneath the ordinary lay subtle inconsistencies, fleeting mentions of arguments, cryptic notes in James' personal journal, and the faint suggestion that someone had been watching the family. These small hints, almost imperceptible in isolation, began to form a web of suspicion, threading through the town's collective consciousness. The audience is drawn into this web, feeling both the tension of potential danger and the emotional weight of uncertainty. Residents began to share stories that had once seemed trivial. A neighbor recalled seeing a man loitering near the riverbank days before the trip, his gaze fixed in a way that made her uneasy. Another mentioned hearing a car start and stop near the Carter's home late at night, its purpose unknown. These accounts were fragments, incomplete and open to interpretation, but they fed the town's growing anxiety. The narrative lingers on the ambiguity of these recollections, showing how human memory and imagination intertwine to heighten suspense. What may have been coincidence becomes ominous when viewed through the lens of fear and uncertainty. Rumors began to swirl, some grounded in observation, others fueled by imagination. There were whispers of disputes over property, hints of jealousy among neighbors, and suggestions of personal grievances that might have escalated. Each rumor acted as both illumination and shadow, offering potential explanations while deepening the sense of unease. The narrative emphasizes how fear transforms perception. Familiar faces become suspicious, familiar places seem charged, and ordinary actions, crossing a street, knocking on a door, take on heightened significance. The town itself becomes a character, its collective psyche reflected in the shifting patterns of suspicion and speculation. Amid these rising tensions, investigators uncovered a few minor but notable clues. A piece of fishing line, frayed and torn, was found snagged on the roots beneath the bridge. A boot print, partially obscured by mud, suggested hurried movement in an unexpected direction. And in a more subtle revelation, the town began to notice that the river, once a place of leisure and familiarity, had hidden treacherous currents, pockets where the water deepened suddenly or swirled unpredictably. These discoveries, though small, reshaped both the investigation and the town's perception of the river itself. What had seemed ordinary and safe now carried the weight of danger and uncertainty. The narrative also delves into the emotional strain on the investigators themselves. Volunteers and law enforcement officers worked tirelessly